Hello, hello, my friends. Thanks for joining me today on our session, our live about burnout and change fatigue. I'm Dottie Posto, and I'm an executive coach, and I am dedicated to supporting women leaders who are facing burnout themselves or working with team members who are on the brink of or in burnout. And today I want to share some deeper definitions of burnout and some strategies inspired by a podcast I've listened to recently, listening to Britt Andreatta, who is a PhD. And she took some things and, made things a little bit broader and went a little deeper into some of the mind and body science behind change fatigue and behind burnout. And that's part of what I want to share with you, as well as give you a few strategies, some of which I've probably shared before, but always want to leave you with a few strategies that you can take and apply immediately. And so we're going to look at things from a slightly different angle. And we're going to talk about why burnout is not just being tired all the time or being so exhausted that, no amount of sleep is going to change it. And we're going to look at both a few personal well-being habits as well as a couple of leadership strategies that can create supportive, resilient work environments. Let's talk about first defining burnout, and we'll take into account Britt Andreatta's definition. So for many people, for as many people as there are in burnout, and recent studies estimate that 80% of women report feeling burned out. And so that's a lot of people and a lot of perspectives. And so there's a lot of varying definitions of how people would define burnout. And, Britt Andreatta explains that burnout is not just simply exhaustion. It is a cumulative state of physical, emotional, and mental depletion resulting from two major things. And they might be one or the other, and more often than not, they're these two things combined. One of them is sustained stress, and the other is constant change. And oftentimes the constant change is what we see as causing the stress, which I did a whole workshop this weekend on just that topic, that it isn't these outside things. Stress comes from the inside. I've talked about it before. I'm sure we'll talk about it again. And again, she talks about its burnout being the cumulative state of physical, emotional, and mental depletion resulting from sustained stress. And we're going to talk about that in detail because we're going to go into the science next. Sustained stress and constant change. So our brains, let's explore a bit of the science behind this. Our brains and our bodies were not built to handle unending change and never-ending stress. Over time, the constant pressure wears down our resilience, wears down our immune system, wears down our body, and leaves us disengaged and less effective. We're not as productive, we're not as creative, we're not as innovative, we just don't get as much done. And so let's first talk about let's dive deeper into kind of our normal stress response. When we have short-term stress, it is really our body's adaptive function. So we have this fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, and mostly it's fight or flight. And under healthy conditions, when we encounter a challenge or a threat, let's say we get cut off in traffic or something scares the bejeebers out of us, our body thinks literally it's going to die. And it releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. This provides us with a quick burst of energy. It sharpens our focus. It helps us respond effectively to a dangerous or challenging situation, whether it means tackling a project deadline or navigating some unexpected crisis, which happened to one of my workshop participants this weekend. In normal, again, short term, this is an adaptive function. And short term, our body then, after the stressor passes, our body is meant to shift from that sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, back to the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest. And the hormone levels return to baseline, our heart rate stabilizes, and we regain that sense of calm, grounded, easeful feeling. And so a moderate amount of stress is actually beneficial to us. It sharpens our focus. It even boosts learning and memory in short bursts. However, so this acute stress response is natural and it's essential for our survival. However, it's designed for discrete, time-bound challenges, not ongoing, unrelenting pressures. There is an impact to this constant, unrelenting stress that we tend to experience. Chronic stress in our brain, let's go there. We end up overloading our system. When changes and demands never let up, when the body struggles to get to that resting state, cortisol levels remain elevated, the brain is effectively stuck in a heightened state of vigilance. Our brain is never stopping this constant hypervigilance, thinking it's going to die. I know that sounds drastic, but it's our primitive brain. We have layers of it and it's thinking it's going to die. And so this high level of cortisol over long periods of time actually can erode neural structures, particularly in the areas that are responsible for our emotional regulation, the amygdala, and our executive functions, the prefrontal cortex, which means when people talk about not being able to think straight when they're angry or upset or in this fight or flight, that's true. This executive function goes offline. When we talk about one of the symptoms that I see in most of the women I coach is that their fuse is getting shorter and shorter. It's because this high level of cortisol is eroding those neural structures that are actually responsible for that emotional regulation, for us to be able to actually use that executive function and go, you know what, I'm going to pause, I'm going to think about this, and then I'm going to respond versus reacting. And so we end up in a state of emotional exhaustion. So remember we talked about the constant physical, emotional, and mental stressor, exhaustion, that is the keystones to burnout. So this persistent stress depletes the energy we need in order to be engaged, in order to be motivated, in order to be creative. And leaders often find themselves feeling numb and disconnected and less empathetic toward team members. They have less of that emotional capacity. And you start to see some of this, what some people may call toxic behaviors, because that empathy, that emotional response of empathy is depleted. So it makes sense that some of these leaders are going to exhibit these toxic behaviors. Now, there's also physical and psychological consequences. Chronic stress is often linked to things like insomnia, headaches, digestive issues. It is very much linked to, over and over we see it, a weakened immune system. So we're more susceptible to illness. What I hear from so many women is that in this state of chronic stress, they are getting sick about every 6 weeks, every 2 to 3 months, something is happening. And sometimes they don't even know it. Things are so crazy, things are moving so fast, they don't even really remember the last time they were sick, unless it's one of the situations where, like a friend of mine was getting sick every 2 weeks. She was under such a constant state of stress, even though she loved her job, she loved what she was doing, it was such a constant state of stress that it just depleted her to the point of just not being able to get her immune system to a point where it could stay healthy. And finally, it shut her down for 3 full months. This also leads to, these physical symptoms also lead to a cognitive decline. So when we're under sustained stress, it impairs our concentration and our memory. You'll often hear people talk about or say they've got brain fog, forgetfulness, difficulty focusing on tasks. And I hear more and more people going in for an ADHD diagnosis when really they are just under way too much sustained stress. And maybe it isn't this kind of over the top constant stress, and they're never getting back to homeostasis. They're never getting back to calm. And so it may not be this super heightened level of stress. It is this constant hum of stress that never ends. And over time, people lose a sense of purpose. They lose a sense of passion that initially drove them to become the leader that they were in the beginning, and that leads them into a full-fledged burnout. Fatigue, cynicism, reduced professional efficacy. Those are just some of the symptoms. When we look at what should happen versus what happens under constant change, is healthy stress cycle. The stressor appears, our body mobilizes, adrenaline, focus, stress peaks, and the stress peak in response, you tackle the issue, you solve the problem, you face the challenge, and then we resolve and get to recovery. Once the threat or demand subsides, the body's stress hormones recede, and you return to that state of calm. So that's the healthy stress cycle. Under chronic or unending change, this chronic stress and an unending change, there is trigger after trigger after trigger after trigger. Change, 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 stress, 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 stress. There's no clear end. Deadlines, restructuring, new tech rollouts, personal life changes, it all stacks up. And the body never has a chance to come back to homeostasis. We are in persistent overdrive. Stress hormones remain elevated. You may feel wired but tired, which is why so many people have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. They are unable to get a full quality night's sleep. So they end up waking up exhausted. And it breaks down our coping mechanisms. So without sufficient recovery periods, your resilience reserves are depleted. And this leads to both physical and emotional and mental exhaustion. Britt Andreatta underscores that our biology has not evolved to cope with this perpetual barrage of change, this perpetual barrage of stress. We're built for episodic stress, not ongoing pressure with no downtime. When we look at what happens, your teams, you and your teams are being negatively impacted. You have diminished engagement on your teams. When stress, when change is unrelenting, your teams and your leaders may become apathetic, disengaged, losing sense of connection to the work, to their team, whatever. That's what one of the women I coach talk about is she knew she was getting into burnout when she was just like, whatever, I don't care. You're going to start to see lower productivity. Chronic stress impairs our cognitive function. It impairs our creativity, making it harder to innovate, making it harder to solve problems, making it harder to maintain a quality level of performance. And what does all that result in? You're going to see on your team increased absenteeism and increased turnover. When we have persistent and constant change and never-ending stress without the proper support, Burnout is going to drive people to either leave or take more sick days. And that just creates even further stress on your teams. As a leader, you play a critical role in mitigating these effects. We all need to recognize our human need for rest, reflection, and supportive structures. That can come in a way of pacing change, bundling change. So it's, here's one thing, here's 3 aspects of it, but here's one change that's coming, and providing more resources that allow employees to come back to that state of calm so that they can remain engaged and productive. Stress is only meant to be short term. And when we have those chronic levels of stress, that high cortisol is going to diminish your employees' emotional regulation capability, their decision-making capability, and their creativity. So in order to avoid burnout, we have to build in rest. We have to build in recovery periods, slow the pace of change, and really see how can we build those supportive cultures. So let's look at a little bit of some of those strategies, because we're going to look at it from the personal side as well as the professional side. So on a personal side, one of the major things is recognizing what you need and setting boundaries in order to get it. Each of us has a core set of needs. We have gifts, talents, needs, and preferences. And when we constantly defer to others' preferences, we are ignoring our own needs. When we constantly are people-pleasing so that people don't get upset with us and we're ignoring our own needs, or when we're going back-to-back meetings and skipping lunch and skipping a healthy meal, we are putting ourselves into that constant state of stress. One of the things that you can promote is mindfulness, which I think sometimes is looked at the wrong way. It isn't just do a mindfulness meditation. It is incorporating a mindful way of living, mindful eating, rather than eating at your desk while you're trying to get things done. Mindful morning routine, having some time to calmly get into your day versus looking at your phone and your email and your calendar and all the things you have to do before your feet even hit the floor. So a mindful morning routine and mindful check-ins. Getting to that point, this is one of the core things I do with my clients, is getting to the point of understanding what do you need moment by moment, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, and check in with yourself. How are you? How are you doing right now? And what do you need right now? Sometimes it might just be water. Dehydration can create brain fatigue. It can create brain fog. It can reduce your capacity for memory. So even just scheduling a break to go get a glass of water, go and get a glass of water and drink a full glass of water, and then bring a glass of water back to your desk. Are there times when you can schedule breaks and downtime, whether that's as a team, where you can hop on a call for 10 minutes just to check in? We do it every morning on the team I'm working on right now. I'm helping out an organization, and our team meets every Monday and checks in. How are you? What you got going on this week? What do you need help with? Takes 30 minutes for like 12 people. It's not that long. Can you schedule a break to walk away, even if it's for a few minutes, to get a change of scenery and recharge, even if it's for a few moments? And if that means walking, or if that means going and sitting in a closed door room and closing your eyes for a minute just to kind of re-establish your bubble. Proper nutrition. When we're skipping meals, we set our body into a state of starvation. Now, planned starvation, I do a fast once a week. That's different. That your body handles that differently than I skip breakfast every day, I skip lunch. Some of this intermittent fasting or intermittent skipping meals, I only eat lunch a couple times a week because I'm just in meetings the whole time. It's throwing your body off and throwing it into a state of stress because it doesn't know when it's going to get its next meal. And so having good nutrition, having regular nutrition so that your body's getting the fuel throughout the day to maintain a state of energy. Create those boundaries that give you more time for the things that nurture you, that nurture your gifts, your talents, your needs, your core self. See if you can invest even 30 minutes a week in something that nurtures your body and your mind. Maybe it's a form of exercise. Maybe it's just going for a walk around the block. Maybe it's a hobby that you haven't worked on in years or done in years. It might be, as a coworker suggested, listening to a guilty pleasure podcast. And when you're spending time, see if you can carve out time to spend with those you care about the most and really be present with those people. Let's shift into some organizational strategies. Those were the personal strategies, and they're vital, and leaders need to cultivate a workplace that really has change paced and employees feel safe. So the personal strategies are great, and pacing change and creating an environment of safety where employees can share how they're feeling and share the feedback. Whether it's slowing down the pace of change or somehow bundling, making sure employees understand why you're making each change, how can you involve them in the process so that they have a say in how it's done, and see if you can package, rather than barraging them with 20 changes in a year, can you bundle them and say, we're doing 5 changes this year. There's this change that has these 3 aspects to it. There's this change that has these 3 aspects to it. Also, see if there's ways that you can help employees release some of their stress with the change. Create a practice that encourages honest and candid feedback without repercussions, without judgment, without a defensive response. And sometimes you may have to be honest up front. We're going to take all your feedback. Some of it we'll be able to act on right away. Some of it we'll really need to think about for future changes, and we value all the feedback. You want to foster that environment where people feel safe, not only with you, but also with their peers. So it's a learned practice for all employees to really be open and accepting of feedback and not getting defensive, or we tried that, that's never going to work. Just really honoring each person's experience and each person's perspective. And really being transparent with your communications. Regularly update your team so that they understand what the change is, why you're changing, how it affects each one of them. So really creating that supportive environment where they can provide feedback, pacing or bundling the change. How can you create that environment of transparent communication? Really check in with your employees. See if you can I always mentioned when I used to teach change management, I would tell people that this is a big part of change management. It's keeping your finger on the pulse of what are the reactions, the resistance, the supportive comments and perspectives on the change, because that's what you need to respond to. Not just what are we doing, when are we doing, why are we doing it, but also what are people thinking? What are their reactions? What are their resistance points? So that you can gauge their stress levels and create ways for it to roll out either in smaller chunks or bundle it so that it is not as many changes over time. We'll wrap up today by just saying that burnout is really multifaceted. It is a multifaceted challenge, and it requires personal strategies and organizational strategies. And that caring for yourself is critical, because if you're in a constant state of stress and you have less emotional capacity, then you may end up becoming one of those reactive, toxic leaders who are reacting to change versus responding, reacting to employees' resistance rather than hearing it, accepting it, and responding to it. I encourage you to really evaluate what are your current routines and culture around change and around burnout and around how you implement change. I'd love to hear any questions or experiences you have. And if you would like to talk deeper, or if you have some folks who could use some one-on-one support, please reach out. I will leave a link to my calendar in the comments if you would like to schedule some time one-on-one to chat. Thanks for being with me, and have a great rest of your week.